to the Dead Kings podcast. So today we want to talk about the war of consciousness. And I'll start in talking about the most interesting origins of that to me are in the Norse pantheons, mythology and cosmology. There is this idea of consciousness and unconsciousness. Maybe unconsciousness isn't the right way to put it, but if I start from the beginning, in my understanding of it, there's the void, Gunungagap, magically charged void, and from that polarities come into being, fire and ice, and from that there's Ymir and Adumla, this cow, and this being whose name just means the roar, or the noise, the scream. And it says, that his left foot had sex with his right foot, and they created all these beings. It was like these swarms of what are called thyrses. And thirst, I think of the word thirst as like if you were like dying of thirst, like that primal reactionary desire for something, to feed, to fight, to fuck. There's like these primal urges, and I see these beings as personifications of that. It's like the unconscious part of you, maybe more animalistic part of you.
Lizard brain.
Sure. But so these beings are swarming together, and eventually they form an order that reflects the original moment of creation. And that point of self-reflection is the first birthing of consciousness itself in the form of Odin, Vili, and Ve, this sort of triune of the three brothers, but essentially they're three different aspects of this archetype of consciousness. And the first act of consciousness is to slay the world that they were born into, which they talk about as Ymir, but really they're taking apart the chaotic, I don't say meaningless, but unintentional ordering of things and putting it together in a way that makes more sense to them, that seems more beautiful and more functional than them. And later on in the saga, Odin sacrifices himself on the world tree to go into the unconscious and perceives the mysteries and uses those to create more order and to give those to humans, which are trees that he turned into these higher beings through the gift of consciousness. So I see it as this repeating pattern of a certain level of consciousness sacrificing itself to create a higher level of consciousness. Yeah. It's like to be born at that higher level is to cease to exist at that previous level. So it's simultaneously a death of the old and a birth of the new. And you see this at sort of periodic, like fractal iterations of different levels throughout the whole mythology. And till, at the end, which is prophesied in the Voluspa, the first story in the Poetic Edda, prophesies how at the end the gods are all going to die and they'll be reborn in new forms, but basically they're going to die. Yeah. And so it's like the chaotic seeds of entropy and death and pain, which are the things that order is trying to protect itself against. They are part of the genetic material which has been used to create this new order. So those seeds are latent in the supposed order, and eventually they always bear fruit and destroy everything anyway, which is part of the cycle progressing to a new iteration of itself. Yeah. And I see it as like this yin-yang of... So to finish that thought that I had, is Ragnarok, from the beginning to the end, is a larger containment of this same cycle, where all of this order comes into being and then it's destroyed, and out of it a new order is prophesied to come into being, but they just give hints about what comes after Ragnarok.
Well,
And aren't super explicit about it, but they talked about being reincarnated through your descendants, and Vidthar avenges Odin and kills the wolf, and is one of the beings that survives and doesn't die in Ragnarok. So that shows like this continuation of Odin in a different form. Anyway, so this yin yang, if you look at like the seeds contained within each other, like the consciousness, even its self creation, is born out of this thursic, animalistic root. And that seed can try to create these fortresses of consciousness, but eventually entropy always destroys it in the end.
Yeah.
But that entropy has been imbued with consciousness now and contains the seed of that, which will always become reborn in a higher and different and better form. And I've heard some people talk about this as pessimistic in comparison to I'll bring it in now. So like this is like the lines up with like the older Iranian understanding of things. The Germanic stuff does, and like the Scythians had contact with the Germanic tribes and shared a lot, and there's like shared artifacts between them, Iranian things with runes on them and stuff. So, but Zoroastrianism was this new thing that came along, and basically he prophesied that there would come a time when consciousness would perfect itself to the point of achieving immortal order, and basically would win this ongoing battle between order and entropy, essentially. Like order would refine itself to the point where it could permanently fend off entropy, and consciousness would be immortalized. And that's seen as more optimistic by some, like we'll eventually win. But I think that the Norse view of the cyclic nature of it feels more authentically true to me. And it doesn't even seem pessimistic in the sense of you can see the positive function of the inevitable destruction.
Yeah.
So when I look at all of these things in the world that I think are shitty and terrible and creating not healthy, creating ill health and disease, dis-ease in people, I think that maybe they're a part of consciousness becoming stronger and more evolved eventually through having to fight against this thing. And this ties into what we've talked about before of conflict strengthening and pressure and ordeal, creating evolution of things.
I think that it's honestly, my instinct is that to think that order will eventually win over on chaos is sort of a foolish thought, because I think that the two concepts are inextricably contingent upon one another. You cannot have one without the other, and they have to be in balance for things to go smoothly. Now, when things go out of balance, when there's more chaos than order, a time of trial will happen, but then eventually it'll balance itself out, and then you'll have more order than chaos for a time, and the scales tip, but eventually they level out.
This reminds me of something that a friend of ours shown, which is totally relevant. I hadn't thought of this until now. Connection. Alan showed me this mathematical thing. They studied the reproductive rate of bunnies.
I remember that.
And they can graph the reproduction rate, and you can look this up, and it'll probably be explained better than I'm about to do it. But what they found is that there's periods of predictability, and they can there's order to the reproduction rate, and it's predictable, and then it switches to chaos, and it's completely unpredictable, and then it switches back to order, and there's a predictable oscillation between chaos and order, which is a sort of higher order in and of itself. And but there's still inevitable periods of chaos in there.
Yeah.
So, what's your understanding of like in today's world, what are these thirsic forces? I think, okay, so
Mm, so many.
yeah,
Um, well, you know, I'm always gonna preach about how modernity, dulls people's senses and wits, and you know, the convenience factor, the ease with which a person can get a dopamine rush from trivial things, like that all contributes to that, the unconscious. People aren't even aware half the time. It's it's uh it's really strange, but it's sad because people are so comfortable just giving away their free will like that. Like, I don't know, I can't speak for anyone really but myself, but I couldn't stand, like, once I saw what was going on, like once I realized that, like, scrolling through TikTok was just a complete waste of time and a distraction from things that were worth more to my life. Like, I could put more energy and time into doing productive things rather than just sitting there getting cheap thrills on videos on the internet. Like, we live in an age of unprecedented unconscious, like, I, I don't know, I don't even know how to put it.
manipulation.
Well, it's manipulation of the people, but, like, I'm talking about the effect of that manipulation. It's unconscious laziness.
People possessed by their. Well, so
Yeah.
here's what I was thinking about when you're saying is like dopamine is the culprit, and not even in a bad way, but it's like I do think it's the common factor,
Oh yeah.
and
It's one of the most powerful drugs on the planet.
it's the source of all motivation. They blocked dopamine in animals and they can't move. You actually can't, you have no motor function without dopamine. So
Dang.
it's like, because you can't initiate the desire to do a thing that's not yet been done.
Yeah.
It's like that gap between where I'm at and what I want. Desire implies that I don't have the thing. So I have to take action and move to pick the thing up and then
Yeah.
I have it. But desire and dopamine is that chemical. I feel like I was thinking of this study where they would show they had little kids and they were like, you can have a cookie right now, or if you decide to not have a cookie right now, you can have 5 cookies tomorrow, or maybe
Mm-hmm.
it was like in
In an hour or something.
in an hour.
Yeah.
And they tracked these kids, and as I remember pretty universally, the kids that chose the cookie did did not do as well in life. They tracked them like 30 years later, and the
Yeah.
kids
I've heard
that
of
could
this.
delay their gratification um, did way better in life,
Mm-hmm.
had more success, more money, more affluence in the world. And I think that shows, it's the animal part that wants the thing now. It's the human higher function that can concretize a future reality that doesn't exist yet
Yeah.
and realize that's better. But it
Mm-hmm.
takes imagination to
Mm-hmm.
do that.
Mm-hmm.
And not only imagination, but faith in the power of envisioning the future
Yeah.
and planning and acting towards it and delaying immediate animalistic gratification for this future oriented, like, worker of will. I'm going to use my
I was
will
gonna say Villy. Yeah.
to suppress the immediate drives of this animal vehicle that I'm in that's like, do this thing. And
Mm.
it's like, no, we're going to do this other thing. And I really think that ability to envision alternate futures that haven't happened before is what separates humans from animals.
Well, it's like you were saying in the beginning. You had the primal, the Thursic forces in the beginning with Ymir, and when Odin, Vili, and Ve came in. Well, what do they represent? Odin is, ecstatic fury. It's drive. It's motivation. It's creativity.
Inspiration.
Inspiration. Vili, the will, the decision to do, and then Ve, the sacred, right?
Sacred space.
Yeah. Well, I'm yes, the sacred space. These concepts going into consciousness, or really creating consciousness out of the chaotic, thursic, unconscious forces, it has, it by necessity has to have a mitigating effect on those thursic forces. And, it's pretty nuts.
I think that you said sacred, I said sacred space. There's an interesting unpacking that. It's like Ve really is separation itself. It's like either
Yeah.
everything's sacred or nothing's sacred. But if we don't have distinction, then we can't choose a pile of shit from a filet mignon. It's like the fact that we can distinguish things is
So it's
separation.
discernment.
You create sacred space by separating it from the mundane. And the stronger that those walls of separation are, the more sacred the space is. That's where the idea of inner sanctum comes from. They'd have a temple, and it's like this area is this sacred, and then this area is more sacred. Only these people are allowed in here.
Yeah.
And then there's this sanctum that like only one guy's allowed inside of on one day of the year.
Yeah.
And that fucking experience he would have in there would be pretty sacred because it's held within this containment of reverence. And whether that's just like a psychological trick or not, that's just the modern way of sort of debunking, like, oh, that's just stupid. But it's like, you don't know what that experience is like for that guy because most people haven't held anything with that much reverence and created that type of container.
Well, that's the power of will.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying is like this ability to separate things out and rank them
Yeah.
and choose one thing as being better than another. That's something that's very taboo in today's world. We're not supposed to have hierarchies of judgment.
Bullshit.
And if something is lower on some hierarchy that we're not supposed to have, we're supposed to do everything we can to lift it up, to make everything on an equal playing ground. And that's sort of the cultural Marxist basis of political correctness that we could say is ruining the world. That would be, but from this larger perspective, it's like the Thursic forces that are attempting to create a Ragnarok. And all throughout the myths, Odin is attempting to stave off Ragnarok by creating soldiers of consciousness, essentially, the Einherjar, who will do battle, but also, the Asgard, the containment of higher consciousness, which was the creation of it was outsourced to an Etin, is an interesting sort of fractal of the same thing that we're talking about is created through that. But yeah, how do we reconcile these opposites? I feel like this cultural trend is clearly fucking shit up, and it's connected to the dopamine addictions that make people less thinking and more animalistic.
Yes. A lot more emotionally charged than logically charged.
Polarized and possessed by one side of the polarity without being aware of the other side.
Well, it's interesting to think about because if you, I mean, Odin trying to stave off Ragnarok but being unable to is sort of like in my mind is indicative that the balance will find itself eventually. I mean, obviously, yes, it's good for people to try to do what is right, and if everyone could agree on what is right, then maybe the world would be a completely different place. But it's in my mind like you almost don't need to do anything. You can just sit back and watch, and you can see the way things play out. Eventually, they will balance out. The scales will tip.
I don't know if that's true.
Maybe it's not.
I mean, we could say it's true, but I think of Odin in the broadest sense, perhaps as this thing that paradoxically can hold or marry opposite things together into this sort of transcendent,
that's the
higher thing.
Magician.
And yes, exactly. And in this essence, you know, he knows that this thing is going to happen, but he isn't just like, well, fuck it, let me just do nothing. He has to
Well, see,
push against it to go ahead.
if he had done nothing, let me tell you something. I've done a lot of thinking about this, and the
I think I know what you're going to say.
what that Odin created Ragnarok when he persecuted Fenrir before Fenrir actually did anything wrong because of something someone else said, a prophecy that he was given.
Yes, essentially.
Yeah.
Well, so go ahead and elaborate your thoughts on it.
Well, again, like as I said, I've done a lot of thinking about this, and Fenrir, the unbridled, chaotic growth and power and untamable strength,
Unrestrained growth.
was it was told, by the vulva to Odin that this would bring about the end of the universe, right? And he reacted to that preemptively before the culprit, the would-be culprit, actually exhibited any signs that he was anything other than an ally or a friend.
He did exhibit signs of continuing to grow endlessly.
That's not any fault of his own, nor is it evil. It is just his nature.
It is cancer.
Cancer is not inherently evil. It's just a byproduct of reality.
It's true, but I guess if he tried to contain the uncontainable thing.
I think that, well, no, I mean, there is a distinct like explanation for Fenrir's fury and vitriol in that he was lied to by the truth god.
I agree with you. I agree with you. I do think that even if that didn't happen, his unrestrained growth would have eventually consumed everything anyway, and that was the point of.
Well, then why not have a good time with him instead of a bad time? If it's going to happen at the end of the day in the same way, what's it matter? Make a friend, not an enemy.
Not here for a long time, but a good.
Here for a good time.
I fucking
exactly.
hate when people say that.
Don't get me wrong. I'm not out here. I'm not a Fenrir apologist or anything necessarily. But I mean, I just see both sides. It's like
I hear you, but I think this is a motif.
The wicked version
in
of Fenrir's
every story where there's a prophecy. It is the attempting to thwart the prophecy, which brings about.
Yeah.
And that is a fascinating time loop sort of motif.
Like, what is it really telling you? Don't listen to prophecies, or do? I guess that's what I'm saying. It doesn't matter either way in the end, if you do or don't. Because the same thing's going to end up happening. The same cycle is going to repeat itself.
So this brings us to Vili and Ve as like, what is the existence of will in the equation?
I mean, apparently the existence of will in the equation is one of the main catalysts because it was Odin's will to contain Fenrir. And that containment created the situation for Ragnarok.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So will is a double-edged sword. You will always suffer some consequence for your willful action. Even if it has, a positive impact, there's still the potential for a negative consequence. And that's the dichotomy of that paradigm. That's life, like equal and opposite reaction, such and such a thing.
I want to follow that. We're getting out there with it.
We are.
I'm into it. Let's do it.
All right.
So if Odin is this force of marrying opposites, and that's part of the like transcendent third function, and there's like high, higher, and highest, good, better, best.
Yeah.
But if we keep the bottom two, what if there's a polarity of will and sacredness?
Mm-hmm.
Odin actually isn't self-identified with will. It's a part of him, but he recognizes the futility of it in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
And what are your thoughts on the polarity if we polarize the concept of will and sacredness?
Man, I don't know. I haven't thought about that. It's interesting. Well, I feel like will is necessary to contain the sacred, right? You have to enforce those boundaries. But again, then, will can be the deconstruction of those boundaries, depending on whose will is stronger, that of the protector or that of the raider, the guy who wants the sacred thing. but didn't want to work to get it. Instead, is willing to burn down the walls and take it. Then is it still sacred? Does it stop being sacred if that type of will is projected upon it? Maybe. It sounds like it would, you know?
I think of just in the modern sense of the common understanding of the words, not like the initiated linguistic Germanic understanding. It's like will is something very individual, and sacred normally has this
Upheld by the
connotation
collective.
of like the gods and where your free will doesn't apply.
Okay.
So it's like the prophecy is sacred, and it's the will that is fighting against the sacredness of the prophecy.
By trying to thwart it.
Hmm.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Which is how the will brings itself into being at higher and higher levels.
Ah,
It needs something to push against.
yeah. Yeah, it needs a problem to solve.
Hmm.
Okay. Huh. Well, that then it entered the unconscious.
Which is funny if you think about Prometheus and the magically charged void. There's
Mhm.
cold, and people resisted the cold and externalized that resistance until they were able to create fire.
Fire, yeah.
And that being, the will of the gods. It's like Zeus was ashamed of humans until, even though he punished Prometheus, after we had fire, he liked us and like
Hmm.
thought we were more godlike. Fucking I was about
I'm mad that you did that, but it was still a good idea.
to Hail Zeus.
Hell, yeah.
um, Makes sense.
Wow.
But that dichotomy is interesting. The way that you need something to resist against to ignite a higher form of being and
Yeah.
will.
You need positive pressure. You need resistance. That's the thing. Conflict is the essence of life, man. Like, let's be real. Peace is death and stagnation, but conflict is what spurs innovation.
I think polarity is more essential, like making love or breathing or dancing. There are all these things or music, uh, require polarity. Conflict is just like one way of interpreting
Interacting
polarity.
polarities.
Yeah.
You know, polarities don't necessarily have to be in constant conflict, but they are by nature because they are polarities. They are adversarial.
Which it makes me wonder if like war, this is going to sound terrible.
Let's hear it. I love it.
If war having a negative connotation is like this weird modern invention.
It certainly didn't used to have as negative a connotation. War
No.
used to be part of the sacred.
Yeah. And
Like,
there's trial by combat.
mhm.
Um,
That's what I'm saying. Conflict has lost its sacredness,
that's true.
certainly.
Which
And
it actually is fucked up when it's not sacred.
yeah, I mean that's so war now is the most impersonal thing in the world. It's like a video game at this point. You fly your little robot around and drop bombs on villagers or whatever. I don't know what
And
war
it
does
doesn't
anymore.
make people better. It gives them PSD and makes them commit suicide.
Well, yeah, yeah, yeah. It doesn't like it doesn't make them better. Just like
We're
you said.
used to,
Wow.
provide people with a sense of connection
Yeah.
and solidarity and providing and protecting.
Yeah. Yeah, like I mean, they used to, back in the day, the Germanics. I was just reading, reread Germania by Tacitus, and was reminded of the fact that the Germanic tribesmen, when they would go to war, they would bring their women and children with them and have them scream from the sidelines, like, go team. They were their cheerleaders, and they were there partly to remind the men of what they were fighting for, and partly to, if they lost, they were getting captured and enslaved and stuff. So like it's even more of a reason to fight as hard as you possibly can. That's why the Furor Teutonicus, the Germanic fury, was something that terrified Romans because they had more to live for and were not unwilling to die for what they had. And it's crazy too because like they were, from according to granted, Tacitus and other Roman sources about the Germanics were biased. They were all biased. Romans were very nationalistic, but um, they marveled at the fact that like the Swabians they had something like 500 or 1,000 square miles of territory that they left 99% of it undeveloped, wild woodland, and that was like to them it was a badge of honor. Like people won't live in my woods for this far around where my village is
Mm-hmm.
because I'm so badass, because they know that Furor Teutonicus, that Germanic fury, is not something you want to fuck with. But
How would they know if someone came in their shit 1,000 miles away? Sense it, smell it.
honestly, yeah, because they walked around barefoot. That's why.
Yeah.
Because they could feel it through the earth. Because they could hear it in the wind, in the trees,
Through the
and stuff.
morphogenetic resonance
Field,
the
yeah,
morphic
that.
field.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
because they were so in tune with that. That's probably what it
That
was.
is a real thing that
Huge amplifier.
we have lost a connection to in the profound way that they had it.
Just walk around outside barefoot.
The
for half an
Swabian
hour,
knot
you'll be
was
all
the
right.
fucking antenna.
It's like an antenna. Yeah, exactly.
There's some truth to that for sure.
I mean, yeah, just it's like not a toroid. It can't really be a toroid, but they tried to
Similar,
make it a
yeah.
thing, But yeah, so sacred conflict is super important, and it's a thing that people have become completely desensitized. They don't even know, not desensitized, oversensitive about conflict to the point where they don't even see it as sacred. They see it as something negative to be pushed away, to be avoided at all costs, and that's why people are getting soft, because they avoid conflict. There is such a thing as healthy conflict. Absolutely. Most conflict can be healthy as long as you approach it with the right perspective. Like training your body, learning how to fight. That's healthy conflict. You don't have to kill your opponent. In fact, it's not a very feasible thing to do, to kill your training partner. You know what I mean? So they say train how you fight, but at the same time, you do have to have some modicum of control over your abilities, or you will run out of training partners.
I think, yeah, just to speak to the other side of it, and I'll try to take a non-biased view. I feel like we could just get canceled just thinking about this shit.
I don't care.
I know, I
I
don't care
truly
either.
don't give a shit.
It was just the awareness of the culture is so fascinating. But colonizers is like the most evil thing, and that gets blamed for like all of the shit that people are trying to be politically correct against and like adjusting for this, while at the same time benefiting from all of the inventions and advances of
Talk about polarity.
almost everything that
Yeah.
came from the colonizers. But the colonizers colonized each other. It's like everybody's been enslaved and
Throughout some point in history.
enslaved. Yeah, throughout some point in history. But I think that there was a point in time where it was culturally normal to like go to a place and if you can, kill all the men and sleep with all the women and stay there for a little bit and then send off another group to do the same thing and keep some there. And it's like the cell like replicating and spreading.
You're speaking of what you're talking about essentially is the Indo-European expansion.
That's 100% what I'm talking about. That's how it happened. But there's an element of prestige that they brought with them that was accepted ultimately by the people that they conquered. And
when you conquer someone, it's hard for them to not accept what you bring them, whatever it is. It's just a lot easier if you do it
there
with
are
a
elements
regal
where
bearing.
people resist throughout history.
Sure. Yeah.
But then there's other things where they just willingly integrate. Willingly is maybe not the best term, but they fully integrate and just release their old language and way of doing things and just become this new thing.
Well, I mean, the different Indo-European like mythology descendants are evidence that it didn't get completely released, but the heavy Indo-European influence, and I'm speaking very broadly here, Indo-European's a big chunk of time. The Yamnaya expansion, even up to like the Scythians and stuff like that, like that's still like the same basic like group. But like, the just very, very simply put, the reason why like Thor is considered a cognate for Indra, and Zeus is because that underlying like mythos traveled to all these different places and integrated with the local populations and became its own unique thing. Not super unique. We still can
Well,
see the
it depends
parallels.
on which time period and how far back you go. But yes, there's a shared genetic thing, and there was this mostly the Yamnaya that spread out all throughout there. And if you look at, which is funny, the like how all of the presidents are related through blood.
Hmm.
Those are Iranian Scythian bloodlines that
Mm-hmm.
essentially, own the banks and stuff, and they call themselves different things now, but genetically, that's where they come from. I just saw an article in Nature talking about this the other day.
Huh.
Anyway, but going back to the original thing I was saying, it's like there's this positive side of war that refines consciousness and being and evolution. It's just like, in nature, it's this competitive world.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there is a thing, such a thing as overdoing it, maybe.
Yeah, there's always such a thing as overdoing it, no matter what it is.
And
That's too much will.
I don't know, like that desire and to just conquer the whole landmass and beyond.
But what are you gonna do after that? There ain't nothing left to conquer if you do the whole thing.
Well, they essentially did, and uh,
Then you get stuck in
part of
complacency.
me can admire that, which I think is good. I've integrated the shadow, and I'm not a part of the victim triangle that's like blaming and wanting to rescue and
Yeah,
feeling persecuted.
yeah,
I can respect this thing.
yeah.
And at the same time, I can see, maybe that was a little bloodthirsty. Literally fucking bloodthirsty. They would drink their enemy's blood.
Capalable, yeah.
Uh, and
Oh man.
so maybe, yeah, I don't know. Just like where is that line where it becomes too much?
Uh, well, I mean, I
Because
think
I
we've
think
already
there's such a thing as not enough of it, which we're seeing in
sure,
today's
yeah.
world being mentally and, genetically homogeneously enslaved
Mm-hmm.
into a singular, non-diverse group that's easier to control.
Mm,
Um, it could be said, for our side, a lack of, sacred conflict
yeah.
as opposed
Well,
to,
like not all. That's the thing. Not all conflict is really like as we've said. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to end in bloodshed. It doesn't have to end in broken bonds of fellowship. It doesn't have to like like modern sports are evidenced of that. I guess a lot of people, especially for like European football, like people will like riot and fight each other. Like whole teams of dudes will fight each other.
I think
But
hip hop in its origins is a beautiful example of what you're talking about. Like
huh,
breakdancing and freestyle battling
yeah,
and I guess graffiti in some sense, those are like these three elements, but like dancing, like there would be dance battles
yeah.
and rap battles,
So
and it came about as a way
huh,
to compete and establish dominance in a way that like earned the respect of the community, but wasn't in any way violent or
violent,
destructive
yeah, yeah.
towards people that you needed. And that's why crack cocaine was introduced and they only promoted people whose music was now about selling crack cocaine because they realized that's too positive and we don't want that. We got to quash that. And there's evidence of that. So but I think that is an ideal, like if you can compete through art forms that elevate consciousness, there's still, I guess we're talking about the difference between competition, which is healthy, and uh, destructive conflict.
Mm, yeah.
Not destroying to create something new or like destroying something as a part of the act of creation, but just destruction for the sake
For
of
the sake of
destruction.
destruction, yeah.
That could be said to be one of the essence of the Thursic
Oh yeah,
force.
yeah, 100%.
Destruction for the sake of destruction.
And it's tempting too, because destruction is super easy, way easier than creation.
I want to pause here. I think we have a part two, but let's split this into different recordings. Be sure to like and subscribe and share this. If you find it interesting, share it with your friends and tell us in the comments what you would love to hear us talk about. All right.